Long before my parents decided to uproot our lives from Boston and drop us into the quiet woods of Vermont, I'd always thought silence was something people exaggerated. In a city, silence is never real. It's just a pause between sirens, or a moment when your upstairs neighbors stop stomping. So when my dad told us we were moving to a place so peaceful you won't believe it, all I heard was isolation. I was 17 and already struggling with anxiety that made my chest tighten at night for no real reason. Moving somewhere even lonelier felt like a punishment disguised as a fresh start. My parents bought a house on Birch Hollow Road, a gravel path buried under towering maples that swallowed up sunlight before it even reached the ground. The first time we visited, it wasn't even on Google Maps, just a pin dropped in the middle of green nothing. The owner, a tall, gray-haired man named Mr. Larson, met us at the porch. He had this soft, careful way of speaking, like every sentence was measured first. But what really unnerved me was that he rarely blinked. And when he did look at me, it wasn't direct. His eyes drifted to my reflection in the front window, studying it with an expression I still can't quite describe. Tight, cold, almost hateful, like I'd done something wrong by merely existing. When he caught me noticing, he smiled too quickly, too politely. I told myself I imagined all of it. My parents were already in love with the house. The price was low, the land was huge, and all I saw was a forest big enough to lose someone in. We moved in 2 weeks later. The first chapter of that new life didn't start with a bang. It started with little things that could be explained away. A rake missing from the shed, a hammer that wasn't where Dad swore he left it, a set of muddy footprints outside my bedroom window after a heavy rain. "Raccoons," Mom said, waving it off. "Deer," Dad said. "They wander close sometimes." But deer don't wear boots, and raccoons don't step exactly where my window faces the woods. One night, while brushing my teeth, I saw headlights move slowly down the road, then disappear behind the trees near the old property line on the north side. It wasn't a neighbor. We only had 2 on our entire road, and both lived farther south. I waited for someone to knock or pull into our driveway. They never did. At dinner, I asked, "Did anyone see a car outside earlier?" Dad shrugged. Mom didn't look up from the pot roast. "People get lost around here," she said. "These roads don't show up on most maps." Maybe that was meant to comfort me. It didn't. Weeks passed, and the strangeness stacked up like loose papers I kept ignoring until they nearly blew away in the wind. The night everything escalated was a stormy one in early November. A heavy wind was rattling the shutters, and the trees outside groaned like they were leaning closer to the house. My parents were at a dinner party in town, and I stayed home to study for a history exam. Around 8, the power went out. Normally that wasn't a big deal, but the silence afterward felt thick. Too thick. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to text Mom, but the signal was garbage as usual. Then came the banging. Not random banging. Not wind-blown shutters. This was slow, controlled, like someone hitting metal with deliberate pauses in between. I stood completely still. It came from the side of the house, the direction of the shed. I told myself not to panic. It's probably the storm shifting something, maybe the loose gutter, anything. But then I heard something that wiped every excuse off the table. The back door downstairs creaked open. Not a bang, not a slam, a slow, unmistakable creak, one I heard every morning when Dad left for work. I froze on the second-floor landing, holding my breath like I could hide from the sound of footsteps moving through the kitchen. Slow, unhurried steps. Someone was walking the house like they were familiar with it. Cabinets opened softly. A drawer slid shut. They were exploring, studying. I darted into my room, locked the door quietly, and grabbed the old aluminum softball bat from the corner. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. I whispered into my phone to the 911 operator, praying my voice wouldn't give me away. "He's inside," I whispered. "Please, please hurry." The footsteps climbed the stairs. Every step landed with a long pause after it, like he was listening between each one. The hallway floor creaked. He stopped inches from my door. The doorknob turned, hard. He pushed. The lock held. Then the breathing started. Slow, heavy breaths pressed right against the other side of the door like he was smelling the air, searching for fear. I heard him lean in. I swear I felt the wood vibrate, and then suddenly nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just silence. I don't know how long I sat there shaking. Bat gripped so tight my knuckles went numb, waiting for the knob to turn again. By the time police arrived, the intruder was gone. But the boot prints he left in the hallway were identical to the ones I'd seen outside my window weeks earlier. No forced entry, no fingerprints, no explanation. My mom arrived home pale and shaking. She hugged me so hard it hurt. "We're changing the locks tomorrow," Dad said, "and installing cameras." I didn't argue. But fear doesn't disappear just because you add deadbolts. For a while, the upgrades helped. Motion lights flickered on every night. Cameras clicked quietly when a squirrel passed. The new locks were solid. We slept a little easier, or my parents did anyway. I didn't. One morning a few months later, Dad called me downstairs. "Becky, can you look at this?" he asked, pointing at the camera feed on his laptop. It was footage from our driveway overnight. Mostly normal, a few raccoons, the neighbor's cat, Mom pulling in late from a shift. Then Dad skipped to 3:12 a.m. A tall, unmoving figure stood at the edge of the tree line. Not walking, not pacing, just standing there, facing the house. For 2 full hours. The frame was grainy, but the posture, stiff, rigid, with squared shoulders, was familiar. I whispered, "It looks like him." My dad didn't respond at first. "Mr. Larson moved 3 states away," he finally said. "A year ago." "Did you tell him we installed cameras?" "Of course not." "Did he know we'd be here alone?" "Becky," he said, "don't go imagining worst-case scenarios." But he didn't deny it. The police came again. They walked the woods, searched the property, questioned the neighbors. But whoever that figure was, they'd already gone. And that was enough to make the whole house feel wrong again. I didn't sleep peacefully for the rest of that year. Not even with the new locks. Not with the lights. Not with the cameras. Every time the house settled, I jolted awake. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. Every creak of the hallway floor felt like someone retracing their steps. One night, months later, I woke to a soft, familiar sound. 3 slow breaths, right outside my bedroom door. I sat up, heart thundering, but when I pulled the covers back and tiptoed to the door, gripping that same aluminum bat, the hallway was empty. No footprints, no noise, just silence, thick enough to choke on. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the fear had rooted itself too deep. But sometimes, even now, when I think of that house on Birch Hollow Road, I swear I still remember the rhythm of that breathing, the same way you remember a nightmare long after you've woken up. And I know, deep down, that some people don't just leave a place when they move. Sometimes they linger, watching, waiting, just out of sight. Fear has a way of whispering truths we try too hard to ignore. When something feels wrong, trust your instinct. Your safety depends on it. Long before the attic light became a code word for panic, I thought fear had a schedule. It came at night, it came in fits, and it left in the morning when sunlight felt like armor. That was before Spokane and before the night someone pushed through my old apartment door and left my confidence shattered in the hallway like glass. I moved home to Patchwood because rent in my broken-down student life was a luxury I couldn't afford, and because my mom, Evelyn, liked to say family was insurance you couldn't buy. She worked double shifts at the clinic and left before dawn sometimes, so I learned the house by the sound of the furnace and the way the porch steps creaked at different temperatures. I learned the route to the kitchen in the dark. I learned to sleep with a hall light on. On the first week back, I patched loose boards, tightened nails, Fix the attic door that refused to latch. I told myself it was just maintenance. I told myself I was doing something honest with my hands. But the night I found a footprint in the attic dust, I understood the difference between a fix and a lie. That boot print was a stamp on the lie that home was safe. It pointed toward the hatch like a blunt accusation. You weren't paying attention. Evelyn left that evening, sleeves rolled down over her hands even though the clinic had heat. She paused in the doorway, turned back, and asked like she always did, "You shut the attic light?" It was dumb because I hadn't been up there in months, not since I moved in. "Yeah," I lied like it was a reflex. Her face softened, and she kissed my temple. "Promise me you'll lock everything." I promised. I meant to keep it. Promises are funny that way, small and fragile until someone tests them. The house had its own breathing rhythm, the radiator clicking, the dog-eared clock in the kitchen that hung by a degree or two, the wind knocking a rhythm off the porch roof. Around 9:30, the house switched from day quiet to something closer to tuned in. I was in my room, headlamp off, scrolling through jobs on a phone that never called me back, when I heard it. Slow, deliberate scraping overhead. At first I thought of rats, then pipes, and then nothing fit right. The sound was patient, like someone rearranging their body above the ceiling. I grabbed the old metal flashlight from the garage because it felt like a talisman. It always did after Spokane. That night a flashlight was a promise to myself. Don't freeze. The attic hatch sat plain in the hall. Nothing special. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and pulled the hatch open. Cold air spilled down, smelling faintly of stale cigarettes and a loneliness that belonged to another person. In the dust, a foot-shaped impression faced toward me. My throat closed. "Jesus," I said aloud, stupid and small. I backed away, slammed the hatch shut, and shoved a chair under it like that would hold a secret at bay. I called my mom. The phone went to voicemail. I called the neighbor, Mrs. Hanley, but she was on the back porch with her television and didn't hear me until I banged on her door half an hour later, barefoot in the snow. "There's someone up there," I blurted. She peered at me with the sharp eyes of someone who'd grown up in a house with more locks than doors and said, "Call the police." I did. The first officer who arrived was young and apologetic. He lifted the hatch, and we both smelled it. That cold cigarette sweet, and a trace of body odor like someone had been camping in a closet. They found bedding, food wrappers, cigarette butts tucked into a corner between the rafters. Photos were the worst. A stack of printed photos, 6 or 7, all grainy and close up. Me asleep on the couch, me hunched over a book, me standing at the window. The dates were spread across weeks. Whoever had been living up there had watched me for more than one night. "Jesus," the cop muttered, paging through the shots. He asked the standard questions. Did I notice anyone suspicious? Any noises? Any cars? I told him about the scraping, the vent rattle, the feeling as if someone had been breathing through the ceiling. He radioed in and a K9 unit came the next day, tracking to the tree line and then losing it like the scent had evaporated. The officers were polite. They filed the report. They said they would follow up. They asked if I wanted to stay somewhere else that night. I said no, because my pride and stubbornness and some far-off idea of normal made me stay. I moved my mattress into my mom's room that night and wedged the old chair under the attic again. I slept with one eye open. Months turned into a constellation of small changes. I stopped leaving the hall light off. I began checking the attic before bed with hands that shook more than they should. I installed a new latch with a padlock. I took the photos to a detective who said he couldn't promise anything. There was no face, no clear prints, and how do you chase a shadow that knows your schedule? He suggested cameras. I bought 3 and mounted them. One in the hall, angled at the hatch, one outside, one in the tree line. You'd think evidence would make the air easier to breathe. Instead, it turned the house into a stage I watched myself inhabit. Once the feed caught a shape crossing the hatch at dawn. A blanket dragged back into darkness. Another morning, The outside camera showed a pair of footprints leading to the back porch and stopping like a question mark. Every time the camera blinked or the feed went black for a fraction longer than the norm, my stomach turned to ice. People tried to be helpful. Evelyn switched shifts sometimes, not often enough. Friends dropped by then, left with faces that said they wanted to help, but didn't know how. I worked nights at the hardware store restocking bolts. It kept me busy and tired. At 3 in the morning, I would sit in the car with the radio on and breathe until my hands stopped trying to pack themselves into fists. The city never found him. The photos, the bedding, the vanished footsteps, all gave us a track that wandered into nothing. I read the police brief twice until the words blurred into a promise they couldn't keep. The worst part, the part that ached, wasn't that someone slept above me. It was that he had watched me in the weeks before, patient like someone saving the best part of their routine. The house had been a stage, and I had been the feature. That realization bled into everything. I couldn't sleep without thinking about lenses, about angles, about the quiet between breaths. Years later, the attic light still makes my hands go cold. I can stand in a kitchen and feel my neck tighten if I hear a vent rattle. I moved out eventually, chased a job across state lines, took night classes again, started a life that was stitched together out of smaller, safer pieces. But the habit stayed. Hall lights on, cameras checked, locks double-checked. I don't go onto roofs. I avoid dark basements. I keep my curtains closed. Sometimes people say I should be angry. Maybe I am. But anger is blunt, and this thing was subtle and long. The real wound is trust. Who would you be if you knew that someone could be living in the space above your head, and you wouldn't know until they pulled down the ladder and stood in the light? The man never came back to the attic that I stayed at least not that we caught. But the idea that he could have been there for weeks, months, making maps of my sleep, that idea cuts deeper than any broken latch. Evelyn still asks sometimes, careful now with her questions. She doesn't say attic light like a test anymore. She says it because she knows what certain phrases can do. Once, over coffee that tasted like burned beans, she reached across the table, took my hand and said, "You did what you could." It was a small absolution. We never catch all our fears. We stack our chairs under hatches, we mount cameras, we call the cops until their voices blur into sirens, and we try to carve safe spaces out of the houses we inherit. For me, the truest thing to say is this: the worst part was not the man himself, but the slow, private way he lived with the knowledge of me. That kind of violation is quieter than a broken window and louder than any alarm. Safety is not only about locks and alarms, but about attention and community. When someone notices and speaks up early, a small scrape under a hatch can stop a long violation before it becomes a life rewritten. I always thought the internet made people braver than they actually were. You give someone a camera and a username, and suddenly they think they're the lead of their own action movie. Maybe I wasn't any different. After losing my part-time video editing job during the pandemic, I spent months sitting in my apartment with too much time, too many ideas, and not enough direction. I binge-watched urban exploration channels, abandoned schools, forgotten factories, underground tunnels, and convinced myself I could do it better. By the time I decided to start my own channel, the world had already moved on from quarantine living, but I hadn't. I was broke, restless, and desperate for something to distract me from the silence of my own life. That's when I found Green Marsh Institute. It sat 3 towns over, tucked in a wooded area off a county highway most people avoided after dark. It had been a psychiatric facility before budget cuts shut it down 8 years earlier. The local forums were full of rumors: squatters, vandals, homeless encampments, and one thread that kept popping up about someone living in the sealed East Ward. Most people laughed it off. I didn't. It felt like the exact kind of place that would launch my extreme midnight exploration series. I convinced 3 friends to go with me: Noah, the loudmouth, Ava, the thrill seeker, and Riley, who just didn't want to be left out. They weren't explorers, not really. They just thought it sounded like an adventure. I promised I'd blur their faces and buy them dinner. That was enough. We planned the trip for a Saturday night. By the time we reached the Green Marsh gates, it was almost 2 a.m. The moon was pale behind the clouds, barely lighting the cracked drive. The fence was bent where last week's storm had knocked a tree into it. Convenient, Noah laughed, kicking a loose sign across the concrete. It's like the place wants us inside. I forced a smile I didn't feel. Let's just get the footage and get out. Nobody took me seriously. They never did. The inside of Green Marsh smelled like damp clothing and rusting metal. Every step echoed off the walls. Water dripped from somewhere above us, tapping in a steady rhythm that made the corridors feel alive. I held the camera close to my face and whispered into the mic like every explorer online did. Green Marsh Institute, abandoned since 2014. Unauthorized entry. Please don't try this at home. Ava snorted. You sound like a discount documentary narrator. Riley swung a flashlight beam across peeling paint, old patient beds, overturned carts. Cobwebs hung off the ceiling. Looks like every haunted place ever, he said. I felt uneasy already. Abandoned places are supposed to feel still, dead, forgotten. But Green Marsh felt occupied. We moved deeper inside. My shoes left prints in the dust. But sometimes I saw other prints. Bigger ones. Older ones. We reached the ECT wing around 2:25 a.m. The hall was narrow, and the air smelled faintly of burnt wiring. I filmed everything. The old therapy chairs, broken cabinets, ripped privacy curtains. That's when we heard it. A soft dragging sound, like someone pulling fabric across the floor. Riley whispered, "Tell me that's just the wind." But the dragging wasn't random. It came in pulses. Steps, drag, steps, drag. Noah cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Anyone home?" Silence snapped down like a trap. Even the water drip stopped. "Dude," I hissed, "stop messing around." "I'm not messing," he whispered back. Then from one of the dark rooms ahead, something erupted. A scream, raw, guttural, animalistic, like a man forcing every bit of air out of his lungs in a single burst. A tall figure exploded out of the darkness, bare feet slapping the tile, long coat swinging, hair hanging over his entire face in filthy clumps. Ava screamed. Riley dropped his flashlight. Noah yelled something incoherent. Then we all ran. I remembered the path we took in, but panic turned every hallway into a maze. We knocked over metal stands, kicked open loose doors, tripped over broken floor tiles. The man stayed close behind, shouting words I couldn't understand, sometimes laughing, sometimes growling, sometimes screaming like he wanted the entire building to shake. "Move!" I shouted. "Go! Go! Go!" We burst into the main hall. I could hear his bare feet slapping faster now, closing in. My chest burned. My throat felt shredded. Ava grabbed my sleeve as she sprinted beside me. "Where's the exit?" "Left," I gasped. "The hole in the fence. Just get to the fence." We hit the main stairwell and nearly fell down it. The exit door banged open, and cool night air hit my face so sharply it felt unreal. We sprinted into the parking lot, shoes skidding across gravel. Behind us, the man reached the top of the stairwell. He didn't hesitate. He came down after us, coat whipping behind him, hair hiding everything but the shadow of his face. Riley screamed, "Open the freaking car!" I fumbled the keys. Noah shoved me aside and yanked the door handles like the car might open from pure panic. Ava was crying but still pulling Riley toward the back seat. The man sprinted halfway across the lot before Noah got the engine started. Tires screeched. Gravel flew like shrapnel. The car shot forward. The man vanished into the darkness behind us. Nobody spoke for 10 minutes. Finally, Ava whispered, "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I remembered something I'd seen when he got close enough for the camera light to catch his coat. Something stitched onto the fabric near his chest. A security badge. Green Marsh Inpatient Security. When I got home, after the longest, most silent car ride of my life, I showered twice, but the smell of mold and fear stayed stuck to me somehow. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and went through the footage frame by frame. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced with a cold, sinking dread I couldn't shake. Around the 7-minute mark of the recording, I paused. There, in the shattered window of an old office, the man stood completely still, watching us, not chasing, not hiding, just waiting. He had been there the entire time, standing motionless like he was part of the building itself. I uploaded the video the next day. It went viral in hours. Tens of thousands of views, comments calling it fake, others calling it the most terrifying real-life footage they'd seen. I should have felt triumphant. People were finally watching my channel, finally subscribing, finally validating all the work I'd put in. But every time I reopened the video, I felt sick. Because the more I watched that still frame, the more I realized how aware he'd been of us, how patient, how deliberate, how long he might have lived inside that building after it closed. A week passed. Then 2. The viral heat died down, but the fear didn't. I kept telling myself I imagined it, that the sleepless nights were messing with me, that the shadows outside my window were just shadows. Then, 1 month later, I was filming a simple Q&A video outside my apartment. Cars drove past. Neighbors walked their dogs. It felt normal, safe, until I rewatched the footage. In the background, standing across the street between 2 parked cars, was a tall figure with long, tangled hair and a dark coat, watching me, not moving, just like before. Chasing danger for attention is never worth it. Some places aren't abandoned. They're just waiting for someone curious enough to walk in. And not everyone who watches you wants to be seen.
Long before that cabin, I kept a small, secret list of sounds I could live with. A running faucet, the neighbor's radio, muffled through thin walls, the steady hum of fluorescent lights at the clinic where my sister worked. Those were manageable. What I couldn't stand was unpredictability, sudden bangs, a floorboard that creaked in a pattern you couldn't predict, voices you couldn't place. A car accident when I was 12 left me with tinnitus, this constant ringing that lives in my skull like a badly tuned radio. It made silence worse because silence gives the ringing space to shout. So when the school announced the weekend retreat at the old history program cabin on Mirror Lake, I tried to laugh. Mr. Caldwell, the chaperone, made it sound almost charming. Quirks, he said, smiling like he owned the place. Doors that don't always want to stay shut. Pipes that complain. Windows that let the lake in sometimes. A real rustic experience. The others cheered. For them, it was an escape. For me, it was a forced immersion in all the things I already tried hard to avoid. I told myself it was just a night. That being with people would drown the ring in my head. I told myself I could handle it. I had read the maps, memorized the roommate assignments, and practiced small talk I wouldn't have to use. When our van pulled off the dirt road, and the fog swallowed the last of the pines, the cabin looked the way Mr. Caldwell described it, half-rotted, leaning like it was tired, the paint peeling in gentle curls. The lake lay beyond, a flat sheet of pewter. It smelled of mud and old leaves. I felt my chest get tight and tried to smile at the obvious lie that I could pretend this was adventure. That first night, we did the usual things. Campfire stories that all sounded like recycled versions of the same cliché. Hot cocoa with too much powder, and the way kids make less of a thing of fear until it's time to sleep. I shared a bunk with Tyler, a quiet kid from my biology class who snored in a way that made his bedmate laugh on purpose. He laughed hard the night he told me about the raccoon that stole a marshmallow. I nodded and tried to let the sound of his breathing be a blanket. After lights out, the cabin breathed something different. The forest has a rhythm at night that isn't the city's. It clicks and sighs, and every noise seems important because there's so little else. My tinnitus was louder. the ringing punching through the quiet until it felt like a presence of its own. I counted breaths and told myself to stop, but then, at 1:14 a.m., I heard tapping on the outside wall. At first, I thought it was branches, but branches don't tap with a rhythm like knuckles. 3 distinct taps, then a pause, then a slow drag along the siding like a hand testing the wood. The sound moved waist-high, down the side, over to the back. Tyler mumbled something and rolled over. I didn't want to be the kid who wakes everyone for nothing. But the tapping came again, closer, deliberate. I nudged Tyler. "Hey," I whispered. He opened one eye. "What? You hearing that?" "Outside," I said. He scoffed softly. "Probably a raccoon. Go back to sleep." But the tapping changed to a knock, 3 slow knocks right at the back door. The cabin's back door had a rusted handle and, from stories, a warped frame. The knocking wasn't violent. It wasn't trying to break anything. It was polite, patient. It had intention. I crawled to the curtain and peered through a slit of cloth. Fog hung close to the glass. For a heartbeat, I saw nothing. Then the shadow, tall, still. A silhouette against the fog standing near the back door as if listening for something inside. My heart bumped a staccato against my ribs. I pulled back and woke Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell blinked in the early light of his phone and tried to make a joke. "Probably just a branch," he said, voice half sleep and full professionalism. "Old cabins do odd things." But when I described what I saw, the way the tapping moved, the figure at the door, the fog wiped clean like a hand had passed over it, his face changed. He went outside with a flashlight while we crouched in the dark like bad actors in a play we didn't want to be in. He came back pale. "Footprints," he said. "Boots. Heavy. Came around the whole cabin. No sign of forced entry, but someone took their time walking the perimeter. The police were 2 counties away. They could take hours. We did the only sensible thing: we barricaded. We shoved bunk frames against doors, piled chairs by windows, locked anything with a latch. I remember the way the wood scraped as we dragged it, the panic sharpened by the ringing in my ears. The tapping resumed, methodical and unhurried, moving from wall to wall like someone reading a book and paging each chapter. At one point, the back door handle turned. A gloved hand wiped the window beside my bunk and peered in. For a breath, I held my mouth open, waiting to exhale. The face couldn't see me. The glass fogged with someone's breath, and the impression of a palm smudged against the glass like a print you see in movies but never expect in real life. Tyler's hands trembled as he whispered, "Do you see that?" "Yeah," I answered, voice the size of a mouse. "Yeah, I see it." The intruder stayed long enough to test, to listen, to make his presence known, then melted back into the fog like he had never been there. We waited until dawn. The world is always sharper when light returns. The lake's surface flashed like a coin. The police walked the shore and lifted prints from the damp ground. Adult male, heavy boots, walking slow, deliberate steps. There were faint tool marks on the back door and a handprint on the window beside my bunk. The chaperone stopped calling it an animal then. "This was a person," he said, finally, like he had tasted something bitter. After that night, nothing felt normal. The cabin closed its doors to me, but the world outside the cabin changed, too. I started checking locks obsessively. I avoided that section of the woods for weeks, driving around the lake whenever a friend invited me back. My tinnitus worsened for a while. The anxiety wound it hotter inside my skull. I replayed the shadow's stillness so often that I could conjure him by thought alone. People asked if I wanted to press charges, to pursue the prince, but the prince were old boots without a name, and the fog had swallowed him like a trick. We filed a report that unwound into paperwork and polite questions. I had photographs of the smudged palm and the indentation where the window fog had been wiped away. I handed them over like evidence of a ghost. The police did what they could, patrolled the area for a few nights, then moved on to other priorities. Life keeps moving. Months later, I walked past a storefront and saw my reflection in the glass and caught myself expecting to see a smudge on the other side like the one on my bunk window. It was ridiculous and real at the same time. The scariest part wasn't that someone had been at the cabin. The worst was the realization that some people don't break and run. They circle, they observe, they test. They don't always want to steal a thing. Sometimes they just want to see. It's been years now. I still avoid remote cabins when friends plan getaways. People think I'm melodramatic, that it's just a story you survive and then laugh about. But the truth is, The memory of that fog and the 3 knocks and the deliberate walk around the walls lives in me. I sleep with a small lamp on even at home sometimes. I prefer busy hotels to quiet houses, and I keep my phone on the nightstand, even in the middle of the night. I did learn, though. I learned the vocabulary of precaution. Report strange prints. Insist on lights. Don't dismiss a tap on a wall as wind. I learned that silence can be a thing that hides intent as easily as sound. And I learned to listen differently, not just to the ring in my ears, but to the small anomalies, the sounds that don't fit the place. It's not bravery that kept me from opening that curtain the first night. It was the knowledge that the world has more people than you know, and some of them will look at your life and decide to watch. Once, years later, Tyler and I met for coffee. He rubbed the table, smiled, and said, "Remember that cabin? Man, I still get chills." We both laughed, but it wasn't the same laugh as before. We shared the same small disquiet now, like a scar in conversation. He added, "I sleep with the lights on too." I nodded. There was comfort in that. Pay attention to the small, odd things, and don't dismiss your unease. Protection often starts with noticing and speaking up, because not every intruder wants your things. Some just want to watch. I can still smell smoke when I close my eyes, a dry, chemical smell that doesn't belong to any normal house fire. It settled in my bones the night we lost the call crew. The night a kitchen flame licked a drywall seam and everything that wasn't bolted down went black. That was months ago, and I keep replaying it between shifts. The woman who couldn't be revived, the child who kept asking where his mom went, the heat that turned faces into nothing. I walked out of that house a paramedic with my hands shaking and my mind taking inventory of every small failure. After that, sleep became a rumor I read about in other people's houses. I would wake to phantom alarms and the insistence of footsteps that didn't belong to me. Grief, sweating and uninvited, moved in and started rearranging my days. Claire always knew when to show up. She'd been gone for grad school, chasing texts and coffee, but she came back for winter break when she learned I was only holding myself together with coffee and habit. She found me hollowed by the night and handed me casseroles and a practical, steady kindness. "You need a break, Ev," she said the first afternoon she arrived, dropping her luggage by the couch like she owned the place. Let me be the boring adult for a minute. The rental house we shared sat at the edge of the town like a tired eye looking into an abandoned monastery. People told stories about that place the way small towns always do, tales of wandering shapes, a bell that sometimes rang at midnight, monks who muttered prayers and then disappeared. I told Claire those were the sort of small-town myths she'd laugh at over her late-night reading. She laughed then, but later, when the snow came early and the wind smelled older, she stopped teasing and started checking the locks with me. The first night she left to pick up groceries, I made coffee and pretended the living room TV was company. The power flickered twice, just the house settling into winter, and then something tapped at the back glass like a child testing the world. 3 slow taps, pause, then nothing. I thought of the burned kitchen and the woman who never woke up, and I told myself it was a twig, or the way ice breaks in a new season. My flashlight cut a cone of light into the backyard and found only fresh snow and the low silhouette of the monastery hill. 10 minutes later, the taps came again, and whispering threaded the house like a radio left on low. I blamed the exhaustion, blamed the phantom alarms that had become my nightly soundtrack. I had been on 100 calls where worry turned into motion, where someone could breathe if you just kept doing something. So I did what I always did. I focused on my breath, on counting out lungs, on the steadying ritual that kept panic from toppling me. It didn't work. The real fear didn't begin until I heard them in the attic, soft, patient steps pacing above the living room. They were too deliberate to be mice. I dragged a crowbar from the fireplace closet, my hands suddenly remembering muscle memory I'd used at scenes, and the attic hatch was sealed tight with 2 screws. I stood with the bar raised until the footsteps shifted and then fell quiet, as if someone on the other side had heard me too. Claire texted she'd be home in 20. I thumbed a reply and, like an idiot, told her not to worry. My pride wanted to protect her from the part of me that trembled. The kitchen light snapped on by itself then, washing the room in a brittle, domestic glare. A man stood framed in the doorway, long brown coat, hood pulled down enough to shadow his face. He held a Bible like a talisman. "You have something that belongs to us," he said. His voice was soft, practiced a sermon clipped to a warning. I would have called the police then if my hands weren't already busy finding the lock at Claire's door. I watched him step further into the house and heard another voice answer from the hallway, older and angry, as if I'd walked into some rehearsal for a conviction. They tried doors the way men test windows, patient, murmuring scripture under their breath like they were summoning something familiar. I climbed out through Claire's bedroom window onto the roof because fear made my body choose the route least expected. Up there, snow stiffened under my palms and the town looked small, a scattering of lights and sleeping cars. The two men moved through the house below with the efficiency of people who thought they already owned the place. They swept flashlights along walls, stopping at the mirror in the hallway. One of them said, like a something learned by rote, "He doesn't know what he inherited." It was the first sentence that made the blood drain from my face. Inherited? I had inherited an ambulance shift pattern and a taste for coffee, not some legacy someone else had claims to. I dialed 911 from the cold roof. My voice rationed into sentences that sounded thinner than they were. The dispatcher promised officers were on their way. I could hear so many of the old calls in the hollow between my ribs, the rhythm of instructions, the repetition of how we stabilize things so that people don't fall into the dark alone. By the time the cruisers arrived, the men were gone. No footprints marred the fresh snow outside and no one reported a break-in. Nothing missing, nothing taken, but inside, someone had carved a symbol into my bedroom door, a circle bisected by a vertical line and a small cross etched at the top. When I brushed away the splinters with fingers that refused to stop shaking, a retired monk who'd lived in town for years visited me, eyes like stones softened by time. "That sign," he said without preamble, "was used when someone was believed possessed by grief. It's a mark for purification, not punishment, a warning and an invitation." Grief as something you could carve into oak felt more real than any dream. It was intimate, like a label stitched into your skin without your consent. The men weren't after money. Not exactly. Their Bible and murmured verses were performative religion as ownership. It hurt my pride to realize I had been reduced to a relic. I had been a man walking away from a house we couldn't save, and now strangers had decided what I contained. Claire came home with groceries and a face that tried to be practical and ended up breaking. I told her pieces: the taps, the attic, the roof, the men, and she held me like the sister she always was, not the grad student. We went downstairs and opened the carved door together. The symbol was crude, but deliberate. She read the retired monk's text messages and called him herself. He spoke like someone conveying an old ache. "They believe grief can infect a place," he said, "or the man. They come to clean what they imagine is contaminated." Weeks went by with officers parked around our block longer than usual, and my shifts became exercises in physical endurance and the illusion of control. I slept in fits and starts. At night, I woke to a phantom knocking that made the skin at my wrists rise. I thought I had made progress: therapy, long runs, the clang of the station, coffee pot stubbornly normal, but the carved warning haunted me in a way that was not entirely irrational. One night a month later, I came home to find a single Polaroid on the kitchen table. Claire and me, laughing in the living room the night she'd first arrived. The picture was warm and ordinary, and the edges were cold. There was no note, no intruder's signature, just that image, and the feeling that someone had been there watching long enough to frame us in film. The retired monk called and told me what he believed with a gentleness that made me want to argue and sit down at the same time. "Sometimes communities try to contain grief by turning it into a thing they can mark," he said. "They carve doors, they pray loud, they believe purification is a ritual with an object. But grief resists tidy labels. It moves like a shadow under the floorboards, and it is not ours to be exorcised by strangers." In the end, the men never came back. The police never found a lead past footprints that petered out in the snow. The monastery grounds kept their quiet, and the locals kept telling the same old jokes about wandering monks. Claire left again for school, but we both were different people when she left, smaller in some small dignity, and larger in our cautious habits. I started checking the windows, closing curtains even though she had told me not to turn our lives into locks. I learned to say aloud the names of the people I'd tried to save. Sometimes it felt like resistance, sometimes like making room for them. We carried on, because what else do you do when the night keeps giving you pieces of itself? I returned to work and to the emergency room rhythm that made me feel useful in a way the carved sign never could. The phantom knocks still came, but they came less and less. The attic remained unused and the monastery kept its shadow. People come into your life with tools, words, scriptures, symbols to fix what they cannot understand. Sometimes they help, sometimes they wound. The thing the men called an inheritance wasn't mine because of wood or blood. It was mine because I had seen what fire could do, and I could not pretend that sight did not live inside me. You cannot hand that to a stranger and expect it to disappear. Trauma and grief cannot be marked away by outsiders. Healing is quieter and harder, done by staying, naming what hurts, and choosing who helps you carry it. I moved into Harborview Tower because I needed a fresh line in the margin of my life. Leaving Nate felt like ripping a page out of a book and then pretending the torn edge wasn't there. Harborview was the nearest thing to a clean sheet I could afford. The place wasn't glamorous, flickering hallway lights, thin walls, that faint, everlasting smell of old carpet, but my apartment faced the harbor and the water made my breath slow in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself freedom would feel like this. Small, cheap, and blue in the evenings. I spent my days illustrating children's books at a tiny desk by the window, and my nights sketching silhouettes of boats. The building had a cast of characters. There was Mrs. Leland on 7B, 80-something and sharp as a brass pin, who fed pigeons and warned me about leaving my curtains open. People watch, she told me with that direct, private look older neighbors give you when they mean it. I laughed it off the first few times. Anyone who'd lived long enough becomes a catalog of cautionary tales, but the advice lodged there like a seed. At first it was little things. A scarf unfolded on the couch. My mailbox key moved in the lock. Cereal boxes left slightly ajar, though I hadn't touched them. I blamed moving boxes, jet-lagged brain, the habit of scanning for Nate's habits, even when I knew they were gone. Then, one damp morning, I found my bedroom door closed. I always left it open. That was the first night the dreams started. Heavy breathing behind closet doors, the feeling of a presence that flattened the air around me. I remember the night it turned from petty to terrifying with near-perfect clarity. I was working late on a spread, ink drying on the paper, when the hallway light outside my door began to flicker. It would pulse once, and then a slow, steady rhythm like a cigarette light held too long until it steadied again. I chalked it up to the building's wiring. Then footsteps stopped outside my door. I assumed, dimly, that it was a neighbor returning late. What troubled me was the peephole. I stepped forward to peer through and the glass suddenly went dark, as if someone's palm had been pressed to the other side. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I backed away slowly. The doorknob twitched once, twice, as if testing. The world gets small in those moments, the sound of my own breath too loud, the thrum of neighborhood life suddenly a distant radio. I called the building security desk and let it ring until it hung up on me. I texted Mrs. Leland and she answered immediately. Go to your bedroom. Now. I didn't ask why. I ran, locked the door, shoved a dresser under the knob, and slid under the bed like I'm embarrassed to admit I still did at 31. I could hear the front door creak open. Someone moved through the apartment with an eerie calm, opening drawers, sliding closet doors, running a hand over the arms of my sofa as if searching for a particular shape. My phone vibrated in my pocket with a text I couldn't read without making a sound. Then a voice, low and patient, came through the crack of my bedroom door. You always leave your curtains open. Time elongated. The voice made ordinary words sound like instruments of intention. I couldn't tell if it was a man's voice or something deeper that had been trained to wait. I heard the slow press of weight against the frame, the muffled intakes of breath right outside the dresser. It felt astonishingly intimate. The intruder seemed less interested in things and more in patterns, how a woman left her curtains, where she kept her favorite mug, what she wore when she answered the phone. A sudden knock from the hallway, Mrs. Leland shouting that she was calling the police, had the intruder bolting. He ran down the stairwell in a sound that felt too small and too quick for the space. I stayed under the bed until the officers came, trembling, ears raw from the adrenaline left ringing. They found pry marks on my doorframe and fingerprints on the window lock. Security footage later showed a hooded man standing outside my door at 3:12 a.m. for over an hour, motionless, facing the peephole, as if watching a portal into my life. When the police left, their faces practiced and polite, Mrs. Leland sat with me in the kitchen, boiling water like it was a ceremony. Some people don't break in to steal, she said, voice flat. They break in to study. She told me she'd seen men on the fire escape before, but never like this, never so still, so patient. After that night I stopped leaving the curtains open. I closed them even in the daytime. In that sense of counter-survival where privacy becomes an action you undertake to protect your small joys, I bought a better deadbolt, begged the front desk to check the stairwell cameras every night, and started carrying my phone like it's a talisman. Friends asked if I wanted them to stay over. I said no more times than I wanted to admit. I couldn't bear the thought of someone learning the rhythm of my life the way that man had, standing outside my door for an hour like he was reading a chapter he intended to memorize. I tried to understand the pattern. Why me? Why this apartment? The answer was simple and awful. I was alone and visible. I painted myself into the world again with the brushes. I had my small illustrations, my late-night coffee runs, and being visible became a liability. The police canvassed, took prints, promised increased patrols. Their reassurances were soft sounds in a room full of hard things. The footage they pulled from the hallway remained maddeningly clear. Him in a hood, never swaying, never pacing, a statue of intent. Mrs. Leland moved out a month later. She said it wasn't the noise or the building. It was that people like him don't displace things. They place themselves in patterns. He didn't come to rob you, she told me the day she packed. He came to learn what you looked at when you slept. Months have passed. I still live in Harborview, but the harbor looks different. The water is a mirror I only glance at. I draw with the curtains closed and hang heavy drapes so even the neighbor's cat can't see the shape of me. When the hallway lights flicker now, my heart still tightens. But the tightening is a different animal, less like a trap snapping and more like a muscle practicing its avoidance. The police never caught him. Sometimes I lie awake thinking about the man in the hood standing at 3:12 a.m., hour after hour, as if time itself had given him permission to observe. Once, while at a gallery opening, a man stood near my work and admired a piece for an uncomfortable length of time. I felt the old itch in my ribs, the memory of being studied. I left early. People tell me to let this be a lesson in resilience, to celebrate that I wasn't physically harmed. I do that on good days. But the truth sits quieter. Intimacy is not consent, and being alone is not an invitation. The scars left by being watched are small and domestic curtains closed, a habit of glancing at door frames, a reluctance to let the light in. It is, perhaps, the price of wanting to see the world again, without someone else writing the margins for you. Privacy is not passive. It's a practice. Keep your boundaries visible and your instincts trusted. If something feels like surveillance, treat it like warning, and act before it becomes evidence. I never wanted the townhouse. When my grandmother died, the lawyer called and then my mother called and then I signed the papers because that's what you do with family things. You inherit the house and the memories and the boxes of stuff you don't have room for. The narrow brick place on Willow Street had a front stoop that leaned a little to the left and a lion's head knocker bolted to the door. Up close the brass looked dull, and when you tapped it, it made a hollow, resonant sound. I told myself it was charming. My chest said something else. When I was 10, somebody broke in while I was upstairs. I didn't see their face, only a dark seam under the bedroom door and the way the floorboard outside creaked in that particular cadence, like a person who knew the house by sound. After that night, I learned small rituals: check the locks, peer through the peephole, slide the deadbolt, leave a light on. They were useless against the memory. They were a promise to myself that didn't keep me safe. Elena loved old things. She loved the way wood warped and paint peeled and the story implied by a dent in a table leg. That's why she stayed. Weekends stuffed with dust and albums of photographs. She'd developed a habit of arriving with coffee and leaving with more boxes labeled in her precise, neat handwriting. We argued, sometimes gently and sometimes not, about what to keep and what to burn. She said the place needed life. I said the place needed a tape recorder to capture nothing happening. We both laughed until the walls hummed. One rainy night, while Elena edited late on the couch, the lion's head rattled. At first I thought it was the storm. The city can do peculiar things to old buildings: wind that slips down a chimney, rain that finds a seam in brickwork. Then the knock came again, slow and methodical, but not the clean brass knock you expect. This was a rattle from inside the ornament itself. I felt my throat tighten and walked to the door barefoot, socks squeaking on the hardwood. The kind of quiet that lives in houses where people are sleeping. The peephole was covered. Maybe someone needs help, Elena whispered when I nudged her awake. I could smell the coffee she'd forgotten to finish. The TV hummed a sleeping blue on a paused film. She slipped on a sweatshirt and followed me. We stood 2 feet apart in the hallway and argued about ordinary things: whether to call the police, whether it was likely to be a prank. She always rounded things toward optimism, like a soft hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. The doorknob twisted then, slow as a thought. Not forceful. Not the frantic kind you see in movies. It felt practiced. A patient test of resistance. Then a scrape, like a key dragged along the frame. "Get something," I said before I realized I was telling her to arm herself. She grabbed her phone and a heavy candle holder from the entry table. I hefted the fire poker like it was a promise. We crept upstairs and crouched in the bathroom because it had a good lock and the only window was frosted. The house breathed beneath us, settling into itself. From the stairwell came humming a tuneless, measured sound that ought to have been benign but pressed like a thumb against my spine. Footsteps padded through the rooms below, brushing the old rugs, testing latches, stopping at the kitchen window, then the back door. "I know you're awake," a voice said from the stairwell. It wasn't a shout, not a demand. It sounded like fact. Elena choked out a breath. I dialed 911 with fingers that didn't feel like mine, and got the dispatcher who told me to stay hidden. We listened to the person move through the first floor, the way a resident moves. There was the casual flick of a light switch, the patient peeking into rooms, the low thump against the kitchen cabinets as if someone was checking for noise. 15 minutes is a long time when you are waiting for the sound of footsteps to stop. It's longer when those footsteps are meant to prove you are not alone in your own house. When the police finally burst in, the intruder fled through the rain, leaving muddy prints by the basement door. I had locked that door, I was sure of it. Yet the tracks told a different story. They put up a patrol for a night, left a note taped to the lamppost in the morning. The house smelled like bleach and fear for days. We had the repairman come in to install cameras, Elena insisted, and I watched him crawl on his belly to the threshold, talking about wiring like it was a pleasant, mechanical poetry. A week later he called me from the stoop, voice flat. "You might want to come see this," he said. Inside the lion's head, someone had fitted a tiny camera with a battery pack and a transmitter. It had been watching the porch and the peephole for weeks, studying us. The metal that had always sounded hollow now sounded obscene. "How long?" Elena asked, and her hands were suddenly the hands of someone who knew how to break glass with a phone. "A while," the man said. "Transmission ran to a receiver. Could be anywhere." We moved out 3 days later. We packed in a fog of coffee and stale pizza, everything shoved into boxes without ceremony. Neighbors watched us from across the narrow street, their faces polite and small. When we signed the paperwork to sell the house, the agent smiled and said everything would be renovated, and that buyers loved that brickwork, with a little history. I wanted to tell her that sometimes history has a weight you can't lift, that some houses keep the record of the wrong things clearly. That night in the new apartment I slept with the curtains closed and the TV loud. Elena's photographs looked soft on the walls, ghosts with purpose. She slipped her hand into mine in the dark and whispered, "We did the right thing." It's easy to find the lesson when you're listening for it. For me, the lesson arrived wrapped in ordinary indignation. Someone had been watching the ledger of our comings and goings and deciding where to step. Watching is not always an act of remote cruelty. Sometimes it's preparation. Sometimes it's testing the swing of doors and the hours you forget to lock the back gate. We tried to be practical. I changed my locks, of course, and we added cameras to the new place. I started to sleep with the lamp on. Those were small defenses, and they quieted the dry part of my fear, the one that knows the world is indifferent. They didn't soothe the small, precise memory of a person on the stair, saying my name like punctuation. "What did he want?" Elena asked once as we folded towels. "Why watch us that long?" "Control," I said. The sense that he could be there whenever he liked, that our routines were research. She pushed a stray hair behind her ear and looked down at her hands. "It's perverse," she said softly, "to collect other people's private hours." I wanted to say more, but words felt like lamps in a storm, small, necessary, but not enough. Life moves in soft increments. The months after were filled with normal things, rent checks, friends who brought dinners, weekends photographing light on old brick. Sometimes the night was louder than I liked, and I would walk the apartment, check the locks, peer through peepholes. Old habits are difficult teachers to unlearn. Once, weeks after we'd sold the townhouse, a neighbor sent a message with a short video captured on a doorbell cam. It showed the new tenants laughing on their porch as someone walked by. The brass lion was gone, replaced by a modern knocker. The video ended with a short clip at midnight. The front door closed, a soft rain, and then a quick rattle. The neighbor said the tenants never could explain it. The replacement door had been installed with new screws and a fresh wood core. At some point, the rattling became a story that folded the street into a cautionary note parents passed along. "Don't leave the peephole uncovered," they said at block parties in the summer, as though it were simple as turning off a light. It's not. Safety is a collection of small, repeated things, locks, cameras, the people you trust. But there's also the strange business of what luck attaches to a house. A house can be a map to a person's schedule, and to the small hours they think are their own, and someone who reads maps without asking can promise to return. When I think back now, the thing that scares me most isn't the person who once stood in the stairwell or the camera tucked in an ornament. It's the fact that those nights changed how I move through ordinary places. I close curtains earlier. I check locks longer. I hesitate when a knock sounds like it could be brass. Not because the city is cruel, but because people can be. The routines that make us comfortable can be observed and exploited. Locks and alarms help, but the deeper protection is the care we show one another. Neighbors who notice, friends who stay when we call, openness about fears that might otherwise be rehearsed by someone watching in the dark.